You open your eyes to a gentle, drowsy light filtering through olive trees. Their leaves shimmer silver in the morning breeze, whispering stories no one has listened to in centuries. You are standing on a slope outside the modest village of somewhere around 300 BCE. This place isn't exactly Athens or Sparta. No, you're somewhere quieter, somewhere softer. The air smells faintly of thyme, damp earth, and something else faintly sweet. You don't know yet. Or as your neighbor calls it, a shell babysitter. He's just jealous because his goats keep climbing onto his roof. The ground beneath your sandals is still cool, dusty from the night. And you're here for snails. That's right. You, a perfectly average citizen of ancient Greece, modest tunic. Mild ambition are but they are picky. They prefer shady corners, moist soil, and soft leaves. Too much sun, and they vanish. Aristophanes joked about them in a play, and Pliny the Elder later on wrote that Greeks fattened snails with wine and bran. It's harvesting day. You crouch low your knees, complain and gently scoop a plump one from the stone. It retreats into its shell like it knows what's coming. You admire it for a second. You'll make someone's appetizer very slippery, you whisper. Yes, the snails of ancient Greece were on a diet richer than yours. Bees hum lazily by. Cicadas sing like broken flutes. You pick another snail and another. Slow work, meditative. A poor man's shimmer. You tried it once. It did not suit your complexion, not metaphorically, into cracks, into bushes, into philosophical oblivion. But the truth is, you don't know. Life may be slow, and look how well that's working for them. You squint, you sigh, you adjust the basket. It leaks, slightly snail. Juice is an occupational hazard. A rooster crows somewhere nearby. You pass stalls, selling olives, wine, tiny figurines of gods. You nod politely to a woman selling goat cheese. She nods back, still offended that you once called her cheese unsettled. But you believe in the slow, loving hand of cultivation. In your little farm, there's a snail named Dionysus. You set your basket down. Snails begin to stir, sensing something. You like to think they're excited. A woman with an embroidered shawl haggles aggressively, as if bargaining with fate itself. You let her win. You were going to give her a discount anyway. You pretend not to look, but you look. They do look like him. Claims snail slime soothes, burns, and balances the humors. You tell him it's mostly just slime. He nods solemnly, as if that confirms everything. Yes. Missing a tooth and has the eyes of someone who has seen too many bad decisions. You've never tried that, but you believe her. People here carry ancient truths in their pockets like lucky stones. You toss him a bit of bread. He stares at it like it owes him money. You hear two philosophers arguing about whether the soul has weight. One insists it does. The other insists it's roughly equal to the weight of an apricot. You side with apricot guy, reminding you that you too can move gently through time. He's enormous, probably 20 seasons old, and moves like a philosopher on a deadline. Nobody cooks Dionysus. He's a local celebrity. Richer folks see it as rustic charm. Ah, yes, escargots hellenica. Can I hold one? They ask. You nod, choosing a calm snail, probably named something philosophical like Pythagoras. Or maybe they just hate poetry hour, which is coming up soon in the square. You do too. It's always very... The child giggles when it climbs their finger. For a moment, you wonder if you should charge for the entertainment. You don't. Not today. You nod at him. He stares back, unrepentant. You tried to explain that escargot isn't Greek, and he blinked like you'd said. The moon was made of lentils. Slightly more tired than yesterday, but maybe a little wiser. Maybe you've been tending this slimy little empire for 5 years now. Some scrolls mention snail mucus as a cure for inflammation. They also believed in applying snail shells to prevent wrinkles. So technically, you're a skincare supplier. Add that to your resume. It started as a joke, a wedding gift from your cousin. Congratulations. May your love multiply like snails. It got out of hand? Not yours. Yours was taken by a fox last week. May Hermes guide its tiny soul. Maybe press that like button as softly as you'd press olive oil into warm bread. Subscribe if you enjoy history as soft as damp moss. And begin the walk to town, passing the same fig tree you pass every day. Remember the cracked vase by the rock? Still cracked. Still sitting there like it's pondering something. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? You stretch. The day ahead will be slow, a little slippery, and mostly uneventful. You probably won't make it through this day without an append. That's perfectly fine. Before we continue, gently close your eyes unless they already weren't. Let your shoulders melt into the present. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You walk down a stone path. The field ahead glistens faintly in the morning dew. But look closely not. All of it is dew. Some of it, wiggles, snails, hundreds of them. Some as small as a lentil, others the size of a fig. Your job is theoretically simple. Keep the snails alive, fat, and edible. In fact, one of the first documented cases of snail farming appears in this exact era. You carry a small wicker basket lined with wet leaves. Not all snails are treated equally. Children from the village visit sometimes to feed him lettuce and ask big questions. Like, do snails? No, they're snails. And can I have him as a pet? You always say no. Historians still debate whether the ancient Greeks truly domesticated snails or just encouraged wild ones to gather conveniently. As the sun rises higher, you begin to notice the subtle choreography of the day. And there it is. First weird tidbit of many. In some coastal villages, by midday, you've gathered enough to sell. You tie the basket shut with twine. You stop at the spring to rinse your hands. Cool water. And as you head into the dust and clamor of the market road, you smile to yourself. The road into Epidaurus is dry and bright. Sunlight bounces off the white stones and right into your eyes, like Apollo himself is playing tricks again. Market day is always the same. Smells of fried dough and fish guts. The sound of arguing bakers, and that one guy who plays the lyre like it personally insulted him. You find your usual corner, third stone pillar on the left. Selling snails isn't glamorous, but it's honest work. A local physician stops by. He's an odd one. Collects snails, not for eating. Here, S. Your major historical fact of the day. A child appears. Small, sticky, curious. You make 3 sales by mid-afternoon. Enough for barley, soap, and maybe a fig or 2. Nearby, a man shouts about carrots, shaped like the god Pan. The air grows heavier with heat. You take refuge behind your pillar, fanning yourself with a cabbage leaf. There's a dog sniffing at your basket now. An old woman passes and whispers, "If you leave a snail on your doorstep overnight, it brings dreams of the sea." Snails, ever sensitive, start retreating deeper into their shells. Historians still debate whether snail farming was an industry or a hobby in most Greek regions. Like knitting, but on your way out, you pass the same goat who headbutted your cousin last month. You leave the village behind. The road winds gently back toward your fields. The olive trees sway. A distant owl begins its evening monologue. And there it is, again that same quiet rhythm. Snails crawling slowly. Tonight, you'll release the snails back into their garden, pour a little wine for Dionysus. After all, in a world full of sprinting myths and warlike heroes, someone has to keep the snails company. And tonight, that someone is you. The twilight air smells like crushed herbs and tired stone. Crickets start there, hesitant chirping. Like a choir warming up before a performance. You feel like you did all right? they feel otherwise. Probably. This, your snail sanctuary. Not even the owl. You walk the familiar path home, basket lighter, sandals dustier. You watch them as they begin to stretch and slither, tracing glistening trails into the grass. The notes twist through the air, catching in the olive branches, dancing between your ears. You sit on a flat stone and let the evening settle in. The snails you didn't sell are still with you, huddled inside their portable houses, judging your sales skills in complete silence. You pause by the edge of your field, a modest patch of shaded land. You untie the basket and gently tip the snails back into their enclosure. They tumble out with the world's slowest enthusiasm. Somewhere in the distance, someone is playing aloe stubble pipe soft and meandering, like wind, part art, part science, part I was bored. You've learned a lot from these creatures. Mostly, how to accept that nothing goes to plan. You think it was therapy? For some of us, watching snails is the only thing that makes sense. You place 2 snails Ajax and Demeter hat the starting line. You whisper, no pressure. They don't flinch. Of course they don't. They're snails. Moths flutter around it, dancing their own erratic ballet. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, sharply, like punctuation. Then silence again. You keep a record of each snail's growth. How much they've eaten? Whether Dionysus tried to escape again? More than you believe in your neighbor's weather predictions. The stars emerge, not in a rush, but like ancient memories, returning one by one. You spot Orion, or maybe not. He always looks slightly different after a glass of wine. The sky is a pale bruise of color lavender, peach, and the softest blue. They're all here, including Dionysus, curled under a rock, like he's hiding from responsibility. A relatable snail. As you dig, your fingers uncover a broken amphora, shard with a faded patina swirl. You turn it over in your hand. This land is older than you. Older than snails. Not profitable, but necessary. The snail pens need fresh soil. The wooden boards need scrubbing. But your art is quiet. It glistens and leaves trails. You know, he says, you could have been a potter, or a baker, or even a priest. You think maybe that's why you've kept them? Not for trade, but for stillness. And the watering pots are clogged with something that might be old moss, or very tiny frogs. A bee pauses on your thumb. You don't move. It's a moment too small to disrupt. You stretch, hear something pop, and hope it was just your knee. She's waving something in the air. You walk to meet her. She pays you in herb sage, lavender, something unlabeled. You thank her and wonder, briefly, if snails really can treat sadness. A bird sings off-key in the fig tree. You hum along. And this is where your day changes. You think about how quiet this life is and how rich. For now. You rinse the leaves. You wash Dionysus with a wet cloth. The other snails peek from their shells, like they're judging your technique. Because tonight, you're trying something new, experimental, bold. You've built a snail obstacle course. Yes, children would cheer. Adults would bet wine. The losing snail was not punished unless being slightly embarrassed counts. A mixture of grape, rainwater, and mild regret. It's for my aunt. She believes snails cure melancholy, using small sticks, tiny gates, and a bit of twine. You've crafted a maze. But here's your weird cultural tidbit. In some rural parts of Greece, you watch as Demeter inches forward. Ajax does nothing. Classic Ajax. Probably contemplating destiny. You sip a little diluted wine from a cup made by your cousin. It's a bit lopsided. So is the wine. As the snails crawl through the tiny course, you reflect on the nature of patience. Scholars still debate whether snail farming was more of a domestic ritual or a commercial practice in ancient Greece. You take a small notebook, your own invention, stitched leather, and parchment tanned. Scribble today's events. You've even named one new recruit Kalia. She's small, but determined. You believe in her. Finally, you lie back on the grass. As your eyes drift closed, you think, not all heroes wear sandals. And with that sleepy, barely coherent thought, you let the night wash over you. You wake to a rooster who doesn't respect boundaries. It's barely dawn. The snails are still sleeping, or meditating. Hard to say. You quietly count them. You stand and brush the grass from your tunic. Today is cleaning day, not glamorous. You begin by gathering fresh soil from the shady grove nearby. Your neighbor appears, uninvited and unburdened by tact. He leans on the fence. You nod. But then, who would care for the emotionally complex snails? He never does. He walks away muttering something about wasted talent, as if talent must always be noisy or sculpted in marble. Today's historical gem. In some Greek households, snails were not just food, but considered symbols of domestic peace. Their slow presence reminded people to savor home life. You replace the soil, gently turning the earth. You pause to drink from your clay cup, and watch the morning unfold. A breeze moves through the olive trees. Suddenly, you hear a voice, faint, distant, calling your name. It's the herbalist from the village. "I need 10 of your fattest snails," she says. "For an ointment." You raise an eyebrow. You nod solemnly. You select the plumpest snails, place them in a jar with mint leaves. Historians still debate how seriously ancient medicine took these months. But anecdotal evidence is a powerful thing, especially when wrapped in lavender. By midday, your field smells like clean earth and wild herbs. The snails crawl lazily across fresh terrain. Your chores are finished. You think about tomorrow's market. You think about how Dionysus might need a new hiding rock, not in coins, but in something deeper, something slower. Like a snail's heartbeat, like sleep arriving at the edge of day. The heat of the afternoon settles like a lazy cat in your lap. You sit under your favorite olive tree, the one with a knot shaped like a confused owl, and you feel the ground breathe beneath you. The snails are quiet. You imagine them whispering to each other in some slimy dialect, gossiping about which leaf tastes better, or why Calliope always hogs the basil. Not for worship, though a quiet nod to Athena never hurts, but to deliver snails to the kitchen servants. A priest requested them for some ceremonial dish. You don't ask questions. You add sprigs of fennel and mint, so they smell like a dream. Presentation is everything. You just raise the price a little and smile mysteriously. Some records suggest they were considered a dish of moderation, neither extravagant nor poor. A kind of spiritual middle ground. Today, you're supposed to visit the temple precinct. You pack the snails carefully into a lidded basket with holes punched in. Airflow is key. Good, he says. We need more people who understand patience. One even claimed that a snail could outlive a lie. You don't know what that means, but it feels poetic. Then he sneezes into his toga and goes back to watching pigeons argue. You pause to look. A few children are playing out some tragedy with exaggerated moans and dramatic death spirals. They're terrible actors. You clap anyway. She has ink on her hands and smells faintly of beeswax. You pass a traveling bard sitting cross-legged by the road, strumming a lyre with half a string. He sings. She inspects the snails with the care of someone who's seen too many bad offerings. Yours pass. The walk to the temple takes you past the old amphitheater. Its steps are sun-bleached and cracked, yet still more stable than your cousin's marriage. Your feet lead you through a shaded alley where fig trees bend toward the path, offering fruit as if they're apologizing for being sticky. You whisper goodnight to Calliope. You close the small wooden gate to their enclosure, more to make yourself feel secure than to actually contain them. You're inclined to believe they were made up on the spot, probably just to get figs. You take one. It's warm from the sun, soft, and too ripe. You eat it anyway. The snails are waking again. Dionysus is already halfway up a stick, looking like he's climbing Olympus. You cheer him on under your breath. You sit cross-legged beneath the same confused owl tree, and let the flavors remind you that life dosing tea needs spices to be good. The back wall of the enclosure is crumbling again, too much rain, or maybe one of the village boys leaned on it trying to borrow a snail. You told him they weren't free-range myths. He didn't laugh. And there it is, today's historical fact. The Greeks did, in fact, eat snails at sacred feasts, often marinated in vinegar and herbs. At the temple gate, a servant greets you with a tired smile. Your hands are soon covered in muck, your tunic decorated with abstract earth art. But the process is calming. A rhythm forms. Scoop, press, pat, sigh. You spot a cluster beneath a lettuce leaf. A new generation. You grin like a proud parent. She presses a small coin into your hand. Not much, but the gods aren't exactly overpaying these days. You can't name them all, but you pretend anyway. That one's the snail of eternal return. That one. The olive of indecision. Each one a little different one, shaped like a crescent moon, one like a fish, a lump. You see Calliope, dragging a leaf 3 times her size, like she's conquering her own Troy. He flops onto the grass with the sigh of someone who's seen too much mediocre poetry. You scratch behind his ears. He tolerates it. Barely. You like to think of them as tiny, squishy philosophers who've solved at least one identity crisis. You thank her. Bow slightly to the marble statue of Demeter in the courtyard, and back away like you've just remembered you're not that religious. You wonder if snails care about luck? They make their own paths. As you turn to leave, an old man on a bench squints at you. That's your obscure tidbit for the day. Some philosophers used snails as metaphors in lectures about time, movement, and the futility of haste. You look out over your little field and see the snails still resting beneath overturned pots and clusters of mint. Snails are nocturnal, after all. You've always liked that about them. It gives you a reason to stay up late without guilt. On your way home, the wind picks up a little, lifting your hair and carrying with it the scent of honey. You rise. Not quickly, never quickly, and rub the sleep from your eyes. Oh, snail. Oh, snail. With house on back. You need no rent. You pay no tax. You teach us all to move not fast and still arrive with soul intact. You toss him a fig and keep walking. Historians still debate whether bard songs like that were improvised or inherited. Back in your grove, the shadows have grown long. You water the herbs, and as night returns and the stars begin peeking out again, you feel a strange kind of peace. Not excitement, not ambition, just quiet. Like maybe the world is still spinning, but at a slower, kinder pace. Morning again. The kind of morning that smells like wet stone and distant honey cakes. Today, the sky feels stretched, pale as linen. Breakfast is a flat round of barley bread and a cube of goat cheese, served on your favorite chipped plate. Today is repair day. You mix a fresh batch of mud and straw, patching the wall slowly. And here's your scholarly uncertainty for the day. Some believe ancient snail farmers used, while others argue they simply herded them into shaded corners. While the wall dries, you check on the eggs. Yes, snail. Eggs. Tiny, round, almost translucent. Fun fact: snails are hermaphrodites. Every snail you own is both mother and father. As you wash your hands, the dog from the village appears again. You spend the afternoon crafting new feeding dishes out of broken pottery. And there's your obscure tidbit. In some parts of the ancient world, particularly in Euboea, broken pottery was considered good luck if repurposed in a garden. The dog leaves, unimpressed. The breeze returns, whispering through the trees. You lie on your back, arms folded behind your head, and stare at the emerging constellations. You close your eyes. The earth is soft. The wind is kind. And everything else can wait. You wake to a drizzle soft, playful, the kind that taps on leaves like it's asking politely to come in. The air is cooler today, damp, fragrant. Everything smells a little more alive. Rain is good for the snails. Very good. You peek out from your doorway and see them already on the move, trailing silvery paths across rocks, boards, and one confused beetle who clearly wasn't expecting traffic this early. You pull your cloak tight around your shoulders. Today, you're visiting an old friend who lives near the coast. A fellow snail farmer, retired but still opinionated. She goes by Aunt Thalea, though she's no one's aunt and plenty of people's problem. You gather a basket, part gift, part barter, a dozen well-fed snails nestled in moist moss, a handful of fresh bay leaves, and a folded cloth embroidered with tiny spirals. You made that, took you forever. The road is muddy, and your sandals make that satisfying squelch with every step. The olive groves blur past, their trunks twisted like they're trying to shrug off centuries. Birds flit overhead, uninterested in you or your slimy cargo. Typical. By midday, you reach her cottage. It's exactly as chaotic as you remember. Part herb garden, part roof, part open-air workshop. She's out front, arguing with a goose. You wave. She waves back, without looking at you. Brought you some quiet philosophers, you say, handing her the basket. She peers in. These are chubby. You're spoiling them. Someone has to, you reply. You sit with her beneath a crooked arbor. She pours you a drink, something made from figs, regret, and possibly mint. It's strong enough to make you blink. She asks about Dionysus. You tell her he's trying to scale a tree now. She nods like that makes sense. He's a climber. Like ambition with a shell. You ask if she misses the farming. Every day, she says. And never at all. She pulls out a scroll. Old, fragile, covered in drawings of snails. Some real, some mythologized. This one, she points, they said could sing, lived on the shoulder of a poet, sang when it rained. You both look at the clouds, now thick with drizzle. No singing. But maybe, if you listen hard enough, you hear something like a hum. Historical fact of the day. In some early philosophical texts, snails were used to describe the concept of kairos, the right, most opportune moment, because you never know when a snail will move, but when it does, it's ready. You and Aunt Thalea talk until the sky softens to silver. You help her feed her herbs. She insists plants like to be fed, not watered. It's emotional, she says. You don't argue. Weird tidbit. Some Greek villagers believed that if a snail crawled over your sandal in spring, it meant a good harvest. If two snails met on your doorstep, it meant a visitor would bring you gossip. Before you leave, she gives you a jar of dried sea fennel and a warning. Don't let Dionysus get too philosophical. That's how mine ran away. You don't ask for details. You walk home under heavy clouds, the smell of wet earth in your nose and that strange fig drink in your belly. Your sandals are soaked. Your soul, strangely warm. Snails greet you when you return. Calliope perched dramatically on the highest stone, as if waiting for applause. You give it quietly. Historians still debate whether snail farming communities traded information or simply lived in parallel silence. But one thing's clear. Where there were snails, there was patience, and occasionally, poetry. You close your door, light a lamp, sit with your snails, and let the evening drift gently over your thoughts. Asterisk, you wake to a drizzle, soft, playful, the kind that taps on leaves like it's asking politely to come in. The air is cooler today, damp, fragrant. Everything smells a little more alive. Rain is good for the snails, very good. You peek out from your doorway and see them already on the move, trailing silvery paths across rocks, boards, and one confused beetle who clearly wasn't expecting traffic this early. You pull your cloak tight around your shoulders. Today you're visiting an old friend who lives near the coast. A fellow snail farmer, retired, but still opinionated. She goes by Aunt Thalea, though she's no one's aunt and plenty of people's problem. You gather a basket, part gift, part barter. A dozen well-fed snails nestled in moist moss, a handful of fresh bay leaves, and a folded cloth embroidered with tiny spirals. You made that, took you forever. The road is muddy and your sandals make that satisfying squelch with every step. The olive groves blur past, their trunks twisted like they're trying to shrug off centuries. Birds flit overhead, uninterested in you or your slimy cargo. Typical. By midday, you reach her cottage. It's exactly as chaotic as you remember. Part herb garden, part roof, part open-air workshop. She's out front, arguing with a goose. You wave. She waves back, without looking at you. Brought you some quiet philosophers, you say, handing her the basket. She peers in. These are chubby. You're spoiling them. Someone has to, you reply. You sit with her beneath a crooked arbor. She pours you a drink, something made from figs, regret, and possibly mint. It's strong enough to make you blink. She asks about Dionysus. You tell her he's trying to scale a tree now. She nods like that makes sense. He's a climber. Like ambition with a shell. You ask if she misses the farming. Every day, she says. And never at all. She pulls out a scroll. Old, fragile. covered in drawings of snails. Some real, some mythologized. This one, she points, they said could sing, lived on the shoulder of a poet. Sang when it rained. You both look at the clouds, now thick with drizzle. No singing. But maybe, if you listen hard enough, you hear something like a hum. Historical fact of the day. In some early philosophical texts, snails were used to describe the concept of kairos, the right, most opportune moment, because you never know when a snail will move, but when it does, it's ready. You and Aunt Thalea talk until the sky softens to silver. You help her feed her herbs. She insists plants like to be fed, not watered. It's emotional, she says. You don't argue. Weird tidbit. Some Greek villagers believed that if a snail crawled over your sandal in spring, it meant a good harvest. If two snails met on your doorstep, it meant a visitor would bring you gossip. Before you leave, she gives you a jar of dried sea fennel and a warning. Don't let Dionysus get too philosophical. That's how mine ran away. You don't ask for details. You walk home under heavy clouds, the smell of wet earth in your nose, and that strange fig drink in your belly. Your sandals are soaked, your soul strangely warm. Snails greet you when you return. Calliope perched dramatically on the highest stone, as if waiting for applause. You give it quietly. Historians still debate whether snail farming communities traded information or simply lived in parallel silence. But one thing's clear. Where there were snails, there was patience. And occasionally, poetry. You close your door. Light a lamp, sit with your snails, and let the evening drift gently over your thoughts. Today is feast day in the village. The kind with garlands on doors, flute players who show up before breakfast, and someone roasting something suspiciously large over a fire they definitely started too early. You wake to the sound of tambourines and a goat shrieking in what you hope is joy. It's the festival of Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, goddesses of grain, rebirth, and mysterious seasonal disappearances. You put on your nice tunic, the one without wine stains in noticeable places. It's a little stiff. You suspect it's aged more than you have. Before heading to the village, you check on the snails. They're lounging in the shade like retired philosophers. You whisper a quick prayer to Demeter, not for grain, but for lettuce that doesn't wilt overnight, and maybe for a slightly better market price on fig cakes. You gather a small offering, a cluster of plump snails nestled in a wreath of rosemary. Not for sacrifice, of course. These snails are guests. You bring them to the festival more as conversation starters than cuisine. In the square, everything is brighter. Children wear crowns of ivy. Bakers yell about pies like they're announcing war. Even your neighbor is smiling, which is either a miracle or a sign of mischief. You set up a modest stall with your snails on display, resting on a flat tile, their shells glistening with olive oil. They look regal. You briefly consider commissioning tiny togas. A woman approaches. She taps one of the snails gently. Is this the one that climbed your wall and vanished for 2 days? You nod. That's Heracles. He came back heavier. No one knows why. She buys him immediately. Says she needs a creature with secrets. Historical fact of the day. During certain festivals, animals including snails were used symbolically, not just as food. Some were believed to carry prayers with them, slowly delivering them to the gods. SIP Honeywine. It's sweeter than you expected. You're surrounded by the scent of roasting meat, citrus, and overripe figs being squashed under dancing feet. At one point, someone recites a hymn to Persephone. It's long, flowery, and only you pretend to understand weird cultural tidbit. In a few rural cults, snails were believed to be creatures that bridged seasons because of their habit of disappearing and returning. Some even buried tiny snail shells with seasonal offerings. You make 3 trades and 1 accidental deal when a boy insists your smallest snail winked at him. You tell him it probably did. As the sun begins to dip, the music gets slower, the laughter deeper. Everyone seems a little lighter, the kind of lightness that comes not from forgetting life's troubles, but from remembering you're not carrying them alone. You wake up next to a snail. Not metaphorically, literally. It's Dionysus. He somehow escaped the enclosure, made the long journey across the grass, and stopped an inch from your ear. You blink at him. He doesn't move. You say, "Why?" He says nothing, which is typical. You pick him up and carry him back like a lost philosopher after a symposium. The morning is quiet. The kind of quiet that smells like old embers and fresh thyme. Today, you're scheduled to visit the apothecary. She's been requesting snail mucus again. She insists it's the key to eternal youth. You suspect she mostly enjoys how gross it sounds when she explains it to people. You gently gather a few snails, coax them into movement on moist leaves, and collect their trails in a small clay bowl. It takes a while. Snail harvesting is not a job for people in a hurry. On your way to town, you see something new. A painting, a wall mural, recently done, depicting village life. There's a man fishing, a woman spinning wool, a dog stealing bread, and in the corner, barely noticeably, tiny figure crouching beside a rock, watching snails. You blink. Is that supposed to be you? You stand there, staring at your own tiny likeness, while the townspeople pass by like it's perfectly normal to be immortalized, doing something most people pretend they never think about. You shrug. Fame is weird. Historical fact. Some rural murals in ancient Greece included agricultural scenes with remarkable detail, including vegetables, birds, and yes, even mollusks. Farmers were rarely the main figures, but they were there. Part of the story. You reach the apothecary. She's rearranging jars labeled bat hair, moon ash, and probably safe. You hand her the snail extract. She sniffs it, nods, pays you with dried lavender and a lemon pastry that has clearly been sitting out since yesterday. Weird tidbit, she says, chewing. Snail slime is good for snake bites, or bad dreams, or both, depending on the snake. You nod like this makes sense. As you leave, you pass a group of school children learning about the gods. One of them whispers, "That's the snail farmer." The others stare like you've just emerged from a storybook. You wave awkwardly. You stop by the shrine on the way home. A small one, non-official, mostly just a stone with coins around it and an old sandal someone left in offering. You place a snail shell near the edge. For luck or irony, scholars still debate whether everyday offerings like snail shells were common or just eccentric. You prefer to believe they mattered, even the smallest gifts. Back home, the snails are active again. Dionysus is gone. Again, you find him halfway up the side of your house. You look up at him and sigh. Do you even know where you're going? He doesn't answer. but neither do you. And maybe that's the point. The wind rustles the trees. The clouds drift by. And somewhere, very slowly, the day crawls into evening. Ask ChatGPT, it's just before sunrise, and the sky is a sleepy watercolor soft purples dripping into rose gold. You're awake earlier than usual. Not by choice, but because a frog leaped into your water jar and sang at full volume like it had a personal vendetta against silence. You step outside barefoot. The ground is damp and forgiving. A low mist hugs the field, making your snail enclosure look like it's floating in a dream more, a very lazy cloud. The snails are unusually active. Maybe they heard you muttering in your sleep again. Or maybe it's just that kind of morning. Dionysus is tracing his usual philosophical circle. Calliope is halfway up a stick she dragged there herself. You suspect it's performance art. Today. You're expecting a visitor. A scholar. Yes, a real one with scrolls and sandals that match. He's coming from Athens to document non-heroic trades of the countryside. You're not sure if that's flattering or just incredibly specific. You tidy the snail area. You pluck weeds like they insulted you. You rearrange feeding leaves into little crescent moons, because maybe presentation does matter. The scholar arrives mid-morning. He's younger than you expected, smells faintly of ink and overconfidence, and immediately steps in something you'd rather not describe, he says, adjusting his scrolls. Snail farming, delightfully slow. You nod. It's a pace, not a profession. He asks questions, lots of them. What do they eat? Mostly greens. How do you keep them from escaping? I don't. Do you name them all? Only the ones who've earned it. He writes everything down, mumbling as he does. At one point, he tries to pet Calliope. She recoils. He apologizes. To the snail. Historical fact. In later Hellenistic writings, scholars did begin documenting trades considered minor or domestic. Snail farming was mentioned in passing. Often dismissed, but always noted with a curious mix of amusement and admiration. You make him Tiefnell and Mintand. He sips like it's a potion. Have you ever considered writing a treatise? He asks. You raise an eyebrow. On snails. On life through snails. He clarifies dramatically. You don't answer. Mostly because Calliope has climbed onto his sandal and refuses to leave. Weird tidbit. In at least one ancient Greek fable, a snail was depicted as a teacher to a tortoise. The moral, even the slow, must guide the slower. Scholars still don't agree what that means. You love it anyway. As the scholar packs to leave, he bows like deeply. Like you just gave him sacred wisdom. You've reminded me, he says. That time is not to be chased. You reply, tell that to your scroll deadline. He laughs, walks off, and nearly trips over your neighbor's rock pile. You return to your snails. They haven't moved much, but then again, neither has the sun, and somehow, everything feels perfectly placed. You lie down in the shade of your confused owl tree. Close your eyes. Let the breeze slip under your thoughts, and let time crawl. Asterisk, it's laundry day, which means it's also curse the wind day. You stand beside a line strung between two fig trees, holding up a dripping tunic and pretending it's not heavier than your will to work. The sky is cloudless. The sun stares at you like it's challenging your stamina. Snails don't do laundry. You envy them. Your tunics flap lazily. One slips off and lands on a snail. You panic. The snail is fine. Probably annoyed. Possibly planning revenge. You hang the tunic again and apologize, formally. Then comes the real challenge. Scrubbing the snail boards. These are the planks you place in the enclosure to give the snails hiding spots, climbing platforms, and, let's be honest, an audience stage. Over time, they get slimy. And not in the poetic way. You haul the boards to the stream. Sit knee-deep in the water. Start scrubbing. It's peaceful work. Meditative. Except for when you discover something living in the crevices. A frog pops out of one board. Possibly the same one from your jar. You stare at each other like exes in a small village. He hops away as you scrub. A young girl from the village wanders over. She's maybe 8. Carries a flower crown that's missing half its flowers, and sits beside you without asking. You farm snails, she says. You nod. Do they know they're slow? You pause. I think they know. I just don't think they mind. She nods like that's a sacred truth. Then, unprompted, she begins naming your snails from memory. That one's Melon. That one's Professor. That one's Tired. You blink. Tired. He never moves, she says. He's a rock, you reply. She shrugs. Still my favorite. Weird cultural tidbit. In certain coastal towns, children would compete in naming snails, claiming theirs could bring rain, win races, or read dreams. You're starting to believe them. You offer the girl a snail to take home. She picks the smallest one and names it Grape. You don't ask why. She walks off, holding it like treasure. You think maybe she understands this world better than any scholar. Historical fact. Some early Greek myths used snails as symbols of mystery creatures tied to the earth, yet never leaving a footprint. One lesser-known tale even features a snail guiding a lost hunter back to his village after 3 silent days. You finish cleaning the boards. Your hands are pruned. Your arms ache. You return to the enclosure, freshly set and glistening in the sun. Dionysus inspects it like a landlord. Calliope climbs the tallest post. The others settle into their favorite corners. You lie back on the warm earth, and for a moment brief and glimmering you feel like you've done something holy. Even if it's just helping tiny creatures glide through another day. The heat is thicker today. It sits on your shoulders like a lazy amphora filled with soup. Everything moves more slowly. Snails, bees, even your thoughts. You fan yourself with a fig leaf, which is wildly ineffective, but feels ceremonial. Across the yard, Calliope is halfway across a plank, stopping every few inches like she's posing for a painter only she can see. You've declared today a no-market day. No bartering, no coins, no awkward eye contact with olive sellers who remember your failed poetry phase. Just you, the snails, and whatever the sky feels like doing. You begin with inventory, not numbers, not weight, just presence. You count each snail by name or shell pattern. Heracles is hiding. Dionysus is inexplicably inside a cracked cup you didn't even know was there. You refill the water trays with fresh rain from a jar you collected last week. It's cooler than well water. The snails appreciate the nuance. Or maybe they just appreciate being damp while you work. You hum a tune from your childhood, something about donkeys and olives, and never trusting a baker with thin wrists. You don't remember the lyrics, but the melody brings back the memory of your grandfather, who once said snails were the god's way of teaching humility. Today's historical detail. In some rural Greek homes, snail shells were kept on shelves as charms for humility and patience, especially in homes with children, possibly because the children couldn't break them as easily as vases you sit in. The shade and open your sketchbook. It's not art, really just squiggles that resemble your snails in spirit, if not in anatomy. You give each one a name and a quote. Calliope, life is a leaf, and I shall chew it slowly. Dionysus. The wall is a concept. Heracles, I could move, but must I? You chuckle to yourself. No one laughs. Not even the wind. A breeze finally does arrive though, carrying with it the scent of crushed herbs and warm stone. You let it wash over your face like a blessing from an invisible priest. Weird tidbit. One obscure rural rite in Thessaly involved whispering secrets to snails before placing them at a crossroads. It was said that whichever direction they chose would carry your wish to the gods. You tried it once. Your snail didn't move for 2 days. Maybe it just needed time. Or maybe your wish was too ridiculous. You take a nap under the arbor. The vines shade you like green curtains. The world softens. A bee buzzes near your ear and doesn't sting you. A miracle. When you wake, the snails have rearranged themselves. Again, you swear they do it just to confuse you, but also to remind you control is a suggestion, not a guarantee. Historians still debate whether ancient farmers truly bonded with their animals, or if we're just romanticizing it now. But you know, deep down, in your snail-slow heart, you know, some bonds don't need proof. You light a small lamp as the sun dips. The flame flickers like it's laughing at your drawing of Dionysus. You eat dinner soft bread, dried olives, little cheese. You offer a lettuce leaf to Calliope. She ignores it. She's busy staring at the stars, so are you. Asterisk, the night brings cooler air, and with it, a rustling in the trees that sounds like gossip among leaves. You can't sleep, so you wander the yard barefoot, listening to the sleepy creaks of wood and the secret sounds of night to night. You're on patrol. Not because anything's wrong, just because some nights call for quiet motion. You take your oil lamp and check each corner of the enclosure. The snails are out more active than you expected. They shimmer in the lamp's light, like tiny, gliding stars on the ground. You sit beside them, tracing their trails with your eyes. It's oddly mesmerizing, like they're writing something only the earth can read. You remember a story your grandmother told you about a farmer who followed a snail deep into the forest and came back with a prophecy. Or a rash. The details are fuzzy. You smile. Tonight's historical fact. In certain mystery cults, especially those tied to Demeter and Hecate, snails were seen as liminal creatures, living between moisture and earth, stillness and movement. They were thought to whisper truths in dreams. You lie down near the enclosure, the grass cool beneath your arms. Above, the stars seem closer tonight. One blinks out, or maybe you just blink. You hear something, a soft scrape. Heracles is attempting to climb your water jug. Again you watch as he makes it halfway, pauses, then slides backwards. With dignity, he tries again. You feel oddly proud. Weird cultural tidbit. Some Greeks used snail shell patterns for divination, claiming that the swirl direction could reveal personality traits. You checked yours once. It told you you were a stubborn optimist with a fondness for quiet. Fair enough, you whisper to Dionysus, who's moving in deliberate spirals. What's the meaning of all this? He continues gliding. You take that as look around. You do, everything's still, but not lifeless. The snails move. The wind stirs. A moth lands on your lamp. The world doesn't sleep, just slows. You think about writing this down, but you don't move. You just lie there, part of the earth. For a while, historians still debate the role of snails in dream interpretation. Some say they were guides. Others say they were symbols of returning home. You close your eyes, and in the gentle dark, the soft glide of snails around you becomes lullaby, poem, and prayer. The next morning arrives shyly, like a guest who isn't sure they were invited. The sun filters through your shutters in long, lazy beams, and the air smells like old stone, warm wood, and something faintly lemony. You sit up slowly. No sudden moves, no big thoughts, just a breath, a stretch, and the quiet delight of discovering that your left leg is covered in tiny snail trails, glittery, glamorous, unexpectedly decorative. Dionysus is the culprit, of course. He's perched on your windowsill, looking smug. Or maybe just ... normal. It's hard to tell with snails. You carry him gently back outside, whispering, let's not make this a habit, though you both know it absolutely will be ... today. You've got a visitor. Not the scholarly kind. A cousin. The one who once claimed your snail enclosure would never last a season, and now raises onions in an angry, competitive way. He arrives carrying a sack of shallots and suspicion. Still farming the slow ones, he asks. You smile. Still rushing. The angry ones. You sit under the arbor, exchanging jabs and bread. He eats loudly. You pour honeyed water into clay cups and offer a bit of goat cheese you've been saving. He declines it like it owes him money. He eyes the snails. Do they even do anything? You gesture to Calliope, who at that moment is scaling a stick with operatic flair. They remind us that doing is overrated. Historical fact of the day. In some rural Greek comedies, slow animals, especially snails, were used as metaphors for wisdom that couldn't be rushed. One surviving script has a chorus of snails lamenting that the world's always late for its own lesson. Your cousin doesn't get it. He watches them for a while, then sighs. I still don't understand why you do this. You look at the snails. The wind, the light drifting like dust through the fig leaves. Because it matters to them, you say, and to me. He doesn't answer. But he stays longer than he meant to. Weird tidbit. There's a tiny mountain village in Arcadia where they still paint little spiral symbols on doorways to welcome slowness. You've never been, but you think about it often. As the day passes, the cousin softens. He even feeds one of the snails a bit of lettuce. He pretends it was an accident. When he leaves, he forgets his shallot sack. You don't mention it. Later you'll plant a few, just to see what angry onions grow like when raised slowly as twilight returns. The snails gather again in their little corners. Dionysus is back in the cup. Calliope has parked herself under the rosemary bush, queen of all she surveys. You sip your water. You feel the coolness of evening press gently against your cheeks. Historians still debate whether rural Greeks ever envied city life, or whether that idea was invented later. You know your answer. You lean back in your chair. Watch the stars arrive, one by one, and you feel undeniably. The morning brings with it a letter, delivered not by courier, but by the baker's boy who insists he isn't a messenger, just carrying things until someone pays attention. The letter is sealed in green wax and smells faintly of olives and candle smoke. It's from the scholar who visited you weeks ago, the one who took notes, spilled tea, and got insulted by Calliope. You unfold the parchment carefully. Dear keeper of the slimebound, I've been thinking of your snails more than I should admit. Your field was quieter than any temple I've known. Enclosed, please find a small scroll of poems I wrote about Dionysus the snail. Not the god, though. One wonders if the difference is meaningful. Yours in unnecessary reflection, S. You smile, then laugh. Then carefully roll the letter and place it in the jar where you keep good things that have no practical use. Today, you decide to try something new. A snail race. Not for entertainment, for science. And because a passing child dared you. Set up a board. Draw a circle in chalk. Place Dionysus Calliope and a volunteer named Turnip on the edge. You say go. Absolutely nothing happens. Asterisk rain again. But this time, it comes with thunder that sounds like someone rolling pottery down the mountainside. You stay indoors, wrapped in a blanket that smells like thyme and old sleep. The snails, meanwhile, are thriving. This is their kind of day, moist, murky, perfect for existential wanderings and slow, aimless rebellions. You watch from the doorway as Dionysus traces the same looping pattern along the side of a clay pot, then pauses dramatically, perhaps, pondering the concept of arrival. Calliope is perched on a fig leaf like she's preparing for a speech. No one asked for. You try writing a few notes in your journal. Things like Heracles refuses to eat from the new dish. Possibly political. Rainwater seems to make them bolder. Or one snail has disappeared. Again. Might be hiding in my sandal. Halfway through your thoughts, the storm lets out a growl. You jump slightly. So does a goat somewhere nearby. You feel seen. To pass the time, you decide to oil some of the older snail boards, an old trick you learned from a traveling tinker who claimed would live longer if it was pampered occasionally. The boards absorb the olive oil like stories forgotten and remembered again. Historical fact: in ancient Epirus, wooden snail boards were sometimes carved with protective symbols not for the snails, but for the farmer. Some believed that keeping slow, careful creatures close warded off reckless thoughts, as the rain taps rhythmically on the roof. You brew a tea from leftover lemon verbena and wild mint. The smell alone clears your thoughts, or at least rearranges them into more comfortable shapes. A loud knock startles you. You open the door to find your neighbor soaked, holding a busted jar, and looking more embarrassed than cold. "Can I borrow a snail?" he asks. You stare. For what? To show my nephew I wasn't making them up. You hand him Turnip, who looks unfazed. The neighbor nods solemnly and disappears into the mist. You'll probably get Turnip back. Probably. Weird tidbit. In at least one known folktale, snails were said to be able to smell lies and would stop moving entirely in the presence of dishonesty. You wish you could do that by late afternoon. The rain softens. You check the enclosure and find a new guest. A wild snail, slightly smaller, shy, clearly from out of town. You name her Echo. Historians still debate whether wild snails were ever tamed or simply accepted into domestic colonies. Either way, you make room. You end the day writing tiny poems in the margins of your notes. Nothing fancy, just things like the moss was wet, the shell was whole, and nothing moved, but everything mattered. And with the fire crackling, the snails dozing, and the storm rumbling off toward someone else's fields, you fall asleep before the tea cools. Rain again. But this time, it comes with thunder that sounds like someone rolling pottery down the mountainside. You stay indoors, wrapped in a blanket that smells like thyme and old sleep. The snails, meanwhile, are thriving. This is their kind of day. Moist, murky, perfect for existential wanderings and slow, aimless rebellions. You watch from the doorway as Dionysus traces the same looping pattern along the side of a clay pot. Then pauses dramatically, perhaps, pondering the concept of arrival. Calliope is perched on a fig leaf like she's preparing for a speech no one asked for. You try writing a few notes in your journal. Things like Heracles refuses to eat from the new dish, possibly political. Rainwater seems to make them bolder, or one snail has disappeared. Again, might be hiding in my sandal. Halfway through your thoughts, the storm lets out a growl. You jump slightly, so does a goat somewhere nearby. You feel seen. To pass the time, you decide to oil some of the older snail boards, an old trick you learned from a traveling tinker who claimed would live longer if it was pampered occasionally. The boards absorb the olive oil like stories forgotten and remembered again. Historical fact: in ancient Epirus, wooden snail boards were sometimes carved with protective symbols not for the snails, but for the farmer. Some believed that keeping slow, careful creatures close warded off reckless thoughts, as the rain taps rhythmically on the roof. You brew a tea from leftover lemon, verbena, and wild mint. The smell alone clears your thoughts, or at least rearranges them into more comfortable shapes. A loud knock startles you. You open the door to find your neighbor soaked, holding a busted jar, and looking more embarrassed than cold. "Can I borrow a snail?" he asks. You stare. For what? To show my nephew I wasn't making them up. You hand him Turnip, who looks unfazed. The neighbor nods solemnly and disappears into the mist. You'll probably get Turnip back. Probably. Weird tidbit. In at least one known folk tale, snails were said to be able to smell lies and would stop moving entirely in the presence of dishonesty. You wish you could do that by late afternoon. The rain softens. You check the enclosure and find a new guest. A wild snail, slightly smaller, shy, clearly from out of town. You name her Echo. Historians still debate whether wild snails were ever tamed or simply accepted into domestic colonies. Either way, you make room. You end the day writing tiny poems in the margins of your notes. Nothing fancy. Just things like the moss was wet, the shell was whole, and nothing moved, but everything mattered. And with the fire crackling, the snails dozing, and the storm rumbling off toward someone else's fields, you fall asleep before the tea cools. After 20 minutes, Turnip moves half a shell's width and stops. You declare them the winner. There are no prizes, just dignity. Historical fact: there's a Roman source borrowed from earlier Greek commentaries that mentions leisure races using snails. They weren't competitive, just slow performances. Entertainment for guests who were very, very patient. You sit back and watch the clouds. One looks like a snail. One looks like your cousin's head. One looks like a snail sitting on your cousin's head. Weird tidbit. In some private homes, snail shells were used as vessels for storing precious perfumes, because why not? They're natural, elegant, and already shaped like secrets. You take a shell from the garden empty, smooth a spiral frozen in Thailand, fill it with rosemary oil. You place it on your table, beside your scrolls. Later, you'll light a lamp, and hold the shell close. The oil will warm gently. The scent will rise. You'll swear the snails pause a little when they smell it. Calliope climbs the raceboard again, long after the event has ended. You suspect she's rewriting history. Historians still debate whether snail farming was a profession or a ritual. You suspect Deplayet was both as the wind picks up and a storm rolls far off in the mountains. You pull your cloak tighter and whisper to your snails. We don't have to go far, just far enough. And with that, you settle in. The night arrives. The spirals continue. And somewhere, on the far edge of slow time, poetry is still being written one tiny trail at a time. Asterisk. The morning begins with dew thick enough to mistake for spilled milk. You step outside barefoot, and the ground greets you like a cold sponge, startling, but strangely welcome. The snails are already awake, or at least present. Dionysus is making slow progress across the rim of a discarded amphora. Calliope appears to be meditating. You decide not to interrupt her. Today, you feel contemplative. Not about the meaning of life, but about the fate of your spare tunic, which seems to have been repurposed by a nearby bird into a suspiciously luxurious nest. You take it as a compliment. You spend the morning reinforcing the snail shelter's cover. Not because it's broken, but because you suspect a hedgehog has been visiting at night. You find a few tiny paw prints, a single spine, and a fig that's been nibbled into the shape of Crete. Historical fact of the day, while not widely recorded, ancient farmers often built dual-purpose shelters both for livestock and smaller creatures. Some even included sections designated quiet corners, which, yes, might have been for snails. As you work, a small group of children stops by. One of them is the flower crown girl. She's brought friends. They want to see the thinkers. You let them in, quietly. Soft steps only. Whispering voices. The kind of reverence usually reserved for temples or napping parents. They gather around the enclosure, like it's a storybook that turned itself inside out. You point out Echo, who's slowly circling a patch of wild lettuce. That's the new one, you explain. She came on the rain. The children are fascinated. One asks, do they dream? You answer, only when you let them. Weird tidbit. In certain parts of Lesbos, it was believed that if a child told a wish to a snail, and the snail moved toward sunlight, the wish would come true. If it turned away, it meant the gods were still thinking about it. One boy crouches and whispers something to Dionysus. The snail pivots ever so slightly toward the sun. The boy gasps. You smile. Later the children leave you a gift, a painted stone with swirls and a tiny inscription. Snail place, you set it proudly on your bench. As the sun climbs, so does the heat. You take refuge in the shade of the olive trees. The snails follow the shadows like slow, determined sundials. Historians still debate whether creatures like snails were ever considered sacred in domestic rituals. No temples, no statues, but plenty of stories. You've heard enough of them to believe. The truth is somewhere in the silence. As the day ends, you place a drop of honey on a flat stone. The snails approach slowly, carefully. Together, you watch. You wait. You feel like a witness to something that doesn't need to be explained. Just noticed * today. You wake up to silence. Not the peaceful kind. This silence feels suspicious. No birds, no wind. Not even the usual creaky grumble from the neighbor's old cartwheel. You step outside cautiously, half expecting to find the world frozen mid-blink. But the snails are moving, which means everything is, technically, fine. Except the enclosure door is ajar. Panic is a strong word, but you definitely feel it in your stomach as you count. 1, 2, 3. Missing, Calliope is gone, Heracles too, and the new Wanako. You check under rocks, behind pots, in your own sandals. Nothing. Then you spot it. A glittering trail that leads out of the enclosure and toward the rosemary hedge. You follow it, careful not to step where you shouldn't. Behind the hedge, nestled in a patch of overgrown mint, you find all 3 Calliope, halfway up a stalk, Heracles lodged in a crack. Echo surveying the yard like she's plotting expansion. You sigh. Explorers now, are we? You carry them back gently, whispering a few choice words about boundaries and bedtime. Historical fact. Greek gardens often included designated corners where creeping things were allowed to flourish, including snails, lizards, and sometimes sacred beetles. These spaces were thought to attract good fortune and keep chaos contained. After the retrieval, you spend the afternoon rearranging the enclosure again. You add a few taller sticks, a second moss patch, and a small sun-baked clay bridge. The snails seem pleased or indifferent. It's hard to tell. Weird tidbit. Some ancient physicians believed that watching snails move could slow a racing heart. They'd prescribe shell time as a calming remedy. You wonder if that was just their excuse to take naps in gardens. Later, a traveling potter arrives. He wants to trade clay bowls in exchange for your homemade herbal oil. You agree, mostly because his bowls are decorated with snails. Not realistic ones, but swirly, dreamlike versions that look like they belong in stories. You choose a shallow bowl with a pattern that spirals inward, like a snail shell caught in a whirlpool. You fill it with water, place a bit of mint at the edge, and let Echo explore it. She seems content. Historians still debate whether decorative pottery ever truly reflected daily rural life or was simply artistic license. But today, art and life feel comfortably close. You spend the last light of day seated beside the enclosure, humming. You notice that Calliope has claimed the new bridge. Heracles is under it. Dionysus is refusing to acknowledge it. Echo glides along the rim of the potter's bowl, slowly, deliberately, like she knows someone is watching. And you are, because that's the whole point. Really, to watch, to wait, and to wonder. The breeze this morning is brisk enough to scatter your scrolls and startle the fig tree into dropping a single, perfectly overripe fruit directly onto your head. You interpret this as a greeting, possibly divine, possibly passive-aggressive. You gather your scattered notes and return to the enclosure. The snails are unbothered, of course. Dionysus has taken up residence in the cool shade beneath a broken tile. Calliope is lounging on a rosemary stalk like a queen reclining on her throne. Echo, ever the newcomer, seems fascinated by the concept of shadows. You sit beside them with a cup of watered wine and a handful of olives that taste like last summer today. You're scheduled to attend a neighbor's poetry recital. He insists. It's informal, but last time he wore a toga with embroidery, which, if we're being honest, is a little much for a backyard gathering. You reluctantly leave the Snails, warning them not to start a coup while you're gone. The recital is fine, there's rhyming. There's a metaphor about goats that you suspect is meant to be political. Someone reads a love poem to their vineyard. Someone else recites in dramatic whispers, which makes you want to sneeze. You clap politely. You eat a sesame cake that tastes suspiciously like disappointment. Then someone spots your embroidered tunica gift from the scholar, stitched with tiny snail spirals along the hem, and asks if you've brought any of your friends. You smile. They're busy running the estate. Historical fact: snails occasionally appeared in Greek symbolism for domestic harmony. One poet even described them as the quiet rulers of the garden, a phrase you may or may not start using as your official title. Back home, the snails seem amused by your absence. Calliope has rearranged the moss patch. Dionysus has climbed the enclosure wall again and is pretending it's new. You sit with them, recounting the poetry in vague terms. You don't name names. Even snails deserve only the best gossip. Weird tidbit: some ancient snail farmers rare. Yes, but Rial believed snails responded to music and praise. They would sing softly while cleaning the enclosures. Not because it worked, but because it felt right. You try humming one of the odes from earlier. The snails do not object. You take this as a standing ovation. As evening rolls in with long golden light and the sound of crickets testing their instruments, you reflect on the fact that you've heard many words today, but none as honest as a snail's silence. You wake to the sound of distant bells, not from the temple. These are goat bells, clumsy and chaotic, like a drunk choir deciding to practice in your general direction. You sit up, stretch, and blink blearily toward the hills. Sure enough, a herd is grazing far beyond your fence, accompanied by a single shouting shepherd and what might be the world's least obedient dog, closer to home. Your snails are gathered unusually close together today. A meeting, a protest. A very slow game of dice. You don't interrupt. You start your day by writing letters. Not because you have news, but because the act itself feels right. One to your cousin, thanking him for the shallots. One to the scholar, enclosing a pressed mint leaf and a poem you wrote in your sleep. Historical fact: letter writing was a cherished habit in many parts of ancient Greece, not just for communication, but as a philosophical exercise, a way to think through ink. Snail farmers likely participated too, especially the ones with more thoughts than conversations. You write one letter to no one at all. You tuck it into a jar and bury it near the enclosure. You don't explain why. You just do it. Later, a merchant stops by, trying to sell you a snail-friendly plow. It's miniature. It's ridiculous. You almost buy it. Instead, you trade him a jar of snail trail balm for a small, perfectly round stone he says buzzes. In the sunlight, you place it in the enclosure. Calliope rests beside it like it was her idea all along. Weird tidbit: in a forgotten play by Euphronios the Younger. A character consults snails for advice, claiming they can hear the voices of plants. The audience reportedly found this more believable than the play's romance subplot. You spend the afternoon sketching, not well, but with devotion. Fern gets a page of her own. She is, after all, your most mysterious snail, always present, never dramatic, and possibly immortal. The wind picks up, scattering petals from the nearby lavender bush. You collect a few and place them on a damp stone. Dionysus parks himself on top like it's a throne made of scent. Historians still debate whether gardens like yours were typical or rare. You hope they were typical. The world needs more slow gardens. You end your day writing a haiku that doesn't quite scan, but you love it anyway. The slowest moment, moss beneath a quiet shell. Time decides to wait. You read it aloud once. The wind carries it off, and the snails. They remain exactly where they need to be. Asterisk, you wake to fog again, but this time, it feels less like a cat, and more like a forgotten curtain draped across the hills. Thick, quiet, and faintly lemon-scented, for reasons you decide not to question. The snails are unusually active. Fern is dragging a small pebble in what appears to be a determined, zigzag pattern. Dionysus is halfway up the olive tree. Again, Calliope is balancing on the tip of a broken reed like a philosopher contemplating the void. You watch them for a long moment, then sigh and say, I suppose today's going to be meaningful. You make a pot of barley porridge, add a pinch of wild honey, and sprinkle it with crushed bay leaf. It tastes like a memory, possibly of a conversation you never finished, possibly of something Calliope told you telepathically. Your neighbor stops by, not to borrow anything, but just to sit. She brings an old stool and a new silence. You nod, and the two of you sit together beside the snail enclosure, saying very little and thinking very much historical fact. In several rural communities across the Peloponnese, it was common for neighbors to engage in quiet visits, silent companionship considered as valuable as conversation, especially near animals, especially near gardens, especially when words got in the way. At one point, the neighbor gestures toward the snails and says softly, they seem to know where they're going. You nod, though privately you know, Heracles has just made a full circle for the third time this morning. But perhaps direction isn't the point. Maybe it never was. The two of you share a few olives, and a plum that tastes like sunlight. Remembered. Weird tidbit. In an obscure cult associated with forgotten household deities, snails were thought to be dream carriers. People would whisper secrets into their shells, then set them loose at dusk, believing the dreams would be delivered in the night. You try it. Whisper something small into Echo's shell, and watch her glide away slowly into the rosemary patch. You don't expect an answer. You just feel better. As the sun rises higher and burns off the fog, your neighbor stands, nods, and walks home without a word. A perfect conversation. You gather the snail sketches you've been hiding under your journal, and hang a few on the side of your garden wall. You title the collection, Portraits in Pondering. The wind picks up. The drawings flutter slightly, as if the snails themselves are nodding in agreement. Historians still debate whether peace is found in ritual or in rhythm. You suspect the snails would say both. And as the evening falls gently across your shoulders, You feel you don't know how else to put it. Aligned asterisk. Today is the day you meant to be productive. You wake with the full intention of achieving something grand. Repairing the garden fence. Updating your snail registry. Maybe finally labeling the different moss types. Instead, you stare at a snail for 20 minutes and forget what you were going to do. This is not a failure. This is your new philosophy. You sit cross-legged near the enclosure and simply observe. You notice how Fern avoids sun-warmed stones. How Echo leans into rosemary stalks like they're old friends. How Calliope has taken a single drop of water and turned it into choreography. You jot down a note. Small movement teaches big stillness. Historical fact. There is a long-lost treatise attributed to Aristarchus the Less, who wrote a philosophical dialogue between a snail and a mouse. The snail wins every argument by simply not replying. You understand that deeply now. A traveling herbalist stops by to trade. She offers you a jar of thyme-infused oil in exchange for information about your herd. You share stories of the personalities, the escape attempts, the silent revolutions. She nods with grave seriousness and offers a second jar for Echo. You accept. Echo nods slightly in response, though it might be a coincidence. Weird tidbit. One old superstition claimed that if you rubbed snail slime on your wrist during a full moon, you'd dream of your next meal. Another claimed it would summon your next disappointment. They might have been the same dream. You decide to test this theory. Carefully collecting one glimmering trail left on a basil leaf, you dab a little on your pulse point. That night, you dream of stew, and forgetting the stew, and someone else eating it. So, maybe both superstitions were right. Later, you finally update the snail registry. You add a note beside Dionysus's name, possibly aware of poetry, and under Fern, moves with intent. Unknown purpose, admired. Historians still debate whether simple, repetitive acts in ancient households like tending snails were viewed as chores or meditation. You no longer care which. The repetition has become rhythm. The rhythm has become story. And in that story, you feel a kind of quiet belonging you never knew to ask for. You close your journal, set it beside the moss, and say aloud, "That's enough for today." The snails do not respond, which of course, is the most perfect reply. He morning greets you like an old friend who doesn't knock, just walks in with the smell of thyme, a cool breeze, and the suggestion that you water the rosemary before it forgets how to be green. You oblige. The snails are still asleep, yes. Snails sleep, sometimes for days, sometimes with one eye closed and the other pretending. This morning, most of them are nestled between stones and leaves, coiled into tight, gleaming commas. Except Fern. Fern is moving, slowly, intentionally. Across the top of the moss bed you fluffed yesterday. It's unclear whether Fern is surveying her kingdom, or just having a particularly involved thought. You don't interrupt. Instead, you make a warm drink wheat milk with crushed date sand. Sit beside the enclosure with your worn slippers and your better than average robe. Today's robe is for thinking, for listening, and today you're feeling contemplative. Not about destiny, about walls. Specifically, the small stone wall around the enclosure. You built it months ago, mostly to keep the snails in, possibly to keep something else out, or maybe to mark the space between your thoughts and the world's. You run your hand. along the top. It's imperfect, uneven. One stone is etched with what might be a symbol or just the results of an extremely bored beetle. Historical fact: ancient Greek rural walls were rarely symmetrical. In fact, intentional imperfection was sometimes practiced, believing a flawed wall wouldn't offend the spirits by being too proud. A humble wall invited better fortune. You decide to add something. You take a shell empty, polished, and wedge it gently between two stones. Calliope emerges from the rosemary and perches beside it, like she's judging your design skills. Weird tidbit: in one obscure seasonal right from the region of focus, farmers would place snail shells around new foundations for luck, not because they brought protection, but because they reminded everyone to move slowly through new beginnings. You look around, the snails are awake now, stretching across rocks, sipping dew, gently dragging their tiny secrets through the garden. Dionysus is upside down for no reason. Echo has once again found the water bowl and is pretending to be decorative, and you feel content. Like the wall, like the moss, like the tea that's gone lukewarm in your hand. Historians still debate whether lives like this, quiet, small, contemplative, were recorded less because they were rare or because they were common enough to be invisible. You think invisibility can be a kind of freedom. You end the day by placing one stone, a new one, smooth and flat, next to the enclosure. On it, you write a single word, here, and you let that be enough. Asterisk: the final morning arrives, wrapped in gentle gold. Not loud, not triumphant, just inevitable, like a sigh at the end of a long story. You wake with no particular agenda. You move like syrup. You eat a fig slowly, almost absent-mindedly. You pet the rosemary bush in greeting. The snails are already in motion. Fern and Echo are orbiting each other like slow stars. Calliope has stationed herself in the middle of the moss patch, looking equal parts queen and furniture. Dionysus, ever the wanderer, is climbing your sandal. You let him. Today, you walk with them. Not in the enclosure note, you take the whole group out. A little field trip. A patch of garden just beyond the fence, beneath the fig tree. You've been saving it. For what, you weren't sure. Until now, you carry them gently, one by one, arrange them on rocks, leaves, bits of old broken tile. You whisper their names softly as you go, like you're introducing them to the earth again. Historical fact: there are records fragmented, but real love, ancient villagers giving thanks to their slowest animals at the change of seasons. Not just livestock, but anything that stayed, anything that endured. Today, you say thanks. You say it in the silence between your steps, in the time you take to place a damp leaf just so, in the breath you hold when Calliope pauses and turns, as if to say, I know. The light shifts. You notice how it glints off each shell differently. Dionysus glows gold, Fern bronze, Echo seems to drink shadow. You lie on your back beside them and let the sun paint patterns on your face through the fig leaves. Weird tidbit: in one lost myth, a god was turned into a snail, not as punishment, but as mercy, so they could finally experience time the way dreams do, stretched, soft, and free of urgency. You fall asleep there, just for a little while. When you wake, the snails are resting too, not in a line, not in formation, just together, quietly claiming their piece of the world. Historians still debate whether these stories matter, whether slow lives left slow traces, Whether gardens like yours changed anything, they did. And as the evening slips in, and your breath deepens, and the air thickens with lavender and dusk, you begin to drift into something softer than memory. A closing spiral, a final quiet, a long, slow pause, ... asterisk. The sky is deepening now, pulling its blanket of stars over the hills. The snails are still. You are still. The whole world is quieter than it has been in centuries. You let your shoulders drop. You feel the cool air slip beneath the collar of your tunic, the scent of mint and olive wood wrapping around your breath like a lullaby. Far off, an owl hoots once. Just once. As if to remind you, the world is still watching, even while you rest. You close your eyes. The soft hum of the garden moves through your skin. You remember the slow rhythm of shells, the spiral path of time, the gentle weight of small lives that made yours feel bigger. And now there's nothing to do. No fences to build. No trails to follow. Only stillness. Only slowness. Only the sweet, sacred act of being. So sleep now, quiet keeper of the garden. Let the spirals keep spinning. Let the snails carry the story. You've done enough. You are enough. And everything that matters is already here. The morning begins with dew thick enough to mistake for spilled milk. You step outside barefoot, and the ground greets you like a cold sponge, startling, but strangely welcome. The snails are already awake, or at least, present. Dionysus is making slow progress across the rim of a discarded amphora. Calliope appears to be meditating. You decide not to interrupt her. Today, you feel contemplative. Not about the meaning of life, but about the fate of your spare tunic, which seems to have been repurposed by a nearby bird into a suspiciously luxurious nest. You take it as a compliment. You spend the morning reinforcing the snail shelter's cover. Not because it's broken, but because you suspect a hedgehog has been visiting at night. You find a few tiny paw prints, a single spine, and a fig that's been nibbled into the shape of Crete. Historical fact of the day, while not widely recorded, ancient farmers often built dual-purpose shelters both for livestock and smaller creatures. Some even included sections designated quiet corners, which, yes, might have been for snails. As you work, a small group of children stops by. One of them is the flower crown girl. She's brought friends. They want to see the thinkers. You let them in, quietly. Soft steps only. Whispering voices. The kind of reverence usually reserved for temples or napping parents. They gather around the enclosure, like it's a storybook that turned itself inside out. You point out Echo, who's slowly circling a patch of wild lettuce. That's the new one, you explain. She came on the rain. The children are fascinated. One asks, do they dream? You answer, only when you let them. Weird tidbit. In certain parts of Lesbos, it was believed that if a child told a wish to a snail, and the snail moved toward sunlight, the wish would come true. If it turned away, it meant the gods were still thinking about it. One boy crouches and whispers something to Dionysus. The snail pivots ever so slightly toward the sun. The boy gasps. You smile. Later the children leave you a gift, a painted stone with swirls, and a tiny inscription. Snail place, you set it proudly on your bench. As the sun climbs, so does the heat. You take refuge in the shade of the olive trees. The snails follow the shadows like slow, determined sundials. Historians still debate whether creatures like snails were ever considered sacred in domestic rituals. No temples, no statues, but plenty of stories. You've heard enough of them to believe. The truth is somewhere in the silence. As the day ends, you place a drop of honey on a flat stone. The snails approach slowly, carefully. Together, you watch. You wait. You feel like a witness to something that doesn't need to be explained. Just noticed, asterisk today. You wake up to silence. Not the peaceful kind. This silence feels suspicious. No birds, no wind. Not even the usual creaky grumble from the neighbor's old cartwheel. You step outside cautiously, half expecting to find the world frozen mid-blink. But the snails are moving, which means everything is, technically, fine. Except the enclosure door is ajar. Panic is a strong word, but you definitely feel it in your stomach as you count. 1, 2, 3. Missing. Calliope is gone. Heracles too. And the new Wanako. You check under rocks, behind pots, in your own sandals. Nothing. Then you spot it. A glittering trail that leads out of the enclosure, and toward the rosemary hedge. You follow it, careful not to step where you shouldn't. Behind the hedge, nestled in a patch of overgrown mint, you find all three Calliope, halfway up a stalk, Heracles lodged in a crack. Echo surveying the yard like she's plotting expansion. You sigh. Explorers now. are we? You carry them back gently, whispering a few choice words about boundaries and bedtime. Historical fact. Greek gardens often included designated corners where creeping things were allowed to flourish, including snails, lizards, and sometimes sacred beetles. These spaces were thought to attract good fortune and keep chaos contained. After the retrieval, you spend the afternoon rearranging the enclosure again. You add a few taller sticks, a second moss patch, and a small sun-baked clay bridge. The snails seem pleased or indifferent. It's hard to tell. Weird tidbit. Some ancient physicians believed that watching snails move could slow a racing heart. They'd prescribe shell time as a calming remedy. You wonder if that was just their excuse to take naps in gardens. Later, a traveling potter arrives. He wants to trade clay bowls in exchange for your homemade herbal oil. You agree, mostly because his bowls are decorated with snails. Not realistic ones, but swirly, dreamlike versions that look like they belong in stories. You choose a shallow bowl with a pattern that spirals inward, like a snail shell caught in a whirlpool. You fill it with water, place a bit of mint at the edge, and let Echo explore it. She seems content. Historians still debate whether decorative pottery ever truly reflected daily rural life or was simply artistic license. But today, art and life feel comfortably close. You spend the last light of day seated beside the enclosure, humming. You notice that Calliope has claimed the new bridge. Heracles is under it. Dionysus is refusing to acknowledge it. Echo glides along the rim of the potter's bowl, slowly, deliberately, like she knows someone is watching. And you are, because that's the whole point. Really, to watch, to wait, and to wonder. The breeze this morning is brisk enough to scatter